for. They can ask for what they want, and it's up to the Malaysian government whether they will give. So I'm quite worried that in the certification process that I talked about, we could end up with an 8-year monopoly on these new biologic medicines, even when they're not patented. The patent term extension thing, strictly speaking, you don't have to give if you are efficient enough. If the Malaysian government is fast in deciding to give a patent, and fast in deciding whether the medicine is effective to cure cancer and safe, it doesn't kill you with side effects, and good quality, the factory is clean, then no patent term extension. The question is the Malaysian government fast enough? There's a set timeline for, I think, the Patent Office one, which is 5 years from date of filing. So if you're longer than that, then you have to give an extension. For the delays by the Ministry of Health in deciding that it's safe, there's no set amount, what is the trigger. It's not clear what is too much, too slow, that causes you to have a longer one. So again, you can imagine that in certification, the US writes the implementing law and says, if you take longer than this very short time, you trigger a patent term extension, you must give my fella a long extension. We just don't know until certification is over what is the final deal Malaysia will end up with. The campaigning question, I actually leave it to the Malaysians, since I'm not Malaysian, what works in Malaysia and what is being done in the various BANTAH campaigns and so on already. I think there's plans for the 23rd that maybe some others can talk to you about. And it's great to do all the campaigning before it's discussed in Parliament on the 26th and before it's signed on the 4th of February. But that's not the end of it. There's still about 2 years when they will be deciding whether to ratify. So yes, good to have your campaigns before the Parliament and the signing, but it's not the end of the world. If it's not stopped then, there's still a chance after that. It's getting late, but it's still a chance. So I leave it to the others who are organising the events.
We had meeting recently with Xiaoyong and Xiaoyong, right? They led us the experience of, let's say, how to organize taglines and whatnot. So we decided on 4 taglines. Basically, the 4 are a longer high price of medicine. Right? And then the other thing is hak pribumi digadai. Basically, to incite the BN people to oppose it. And then the third thing is kedaulatan countries. And the fourth is job losses. Local workers who will be losing their jobs. So we had a vote. We listed down as many as possible, and then we had a vote and came up with this 4. So we're still open, but this 4 would be the main deadlines for mobilizing mobilization on the 23rd of January, Saturday, 2 o'clock. Dataran Merdeka. We have 11 days. We have 11 days from now. So we'll be organizing a lot of press conferences and whatnot, basically to highlight these dates. And we welcome the support of your NGOs.
There's, one other thing that you might hear a lot about with the TPP is, it's, these 12 countries are 40% of gross domestic product, 800 million, we must be in it to win it, we have to be in the market. But remember, the baseline today is all the 12 TPP countries are in the World Trade Organization already, where the US is not allowed to raise their tariffs above the level that they have bound, even on Malaysia's products, even if Malaysia doesn't sign the TPP. They are locked, they cannot go above to punish Malaysia. And the locked-in average is 3%, which is pretty low. Because remember, you go to 0, it costs you 5% in cost of compliance to get to the 0. So of the WTO, we're all in the WTO to start with, then Malaysia already has free trade agreements with low or 0 tariffs with all the TPP countries except 4. Of those 4, it's US who has low tariffs, 3%, not much difference. Canada, low tariffs, 6%. So that leaves Mexico and Peru. If this is really such an important thing to get Malaysian exports into Mexico and Peru, then you have a free trade agreement now with Mexico and Peru, where we just have 6 chapters about removing tariffs, and none of these chapters on intellectual property and ISDS and these other things. So people will say, but if you protect the investors, then you protect the Malaysian investors as well, right? Number 1, are there many Malaysian investors going abroad? Number 2, where are they investing? If they're investing in US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, probably even Singapore, the domestic courts are pretty good. We trust them. The domestic law is good. The courts are not corrupt. They are fast. They are independent of the government. So if anything bad happens to the Malaysian investor in Australia, he can sue the Australian government under Australian law in the Australian courts and get a pretty good deal. Same for New Zealand, Canada, US, Singapore, right? US, you get triple damages. Very nice. So where is it that the Malaysian investors need more protection than domestic law and domestic courts, which they already get? Okay, if it's Brunei, Vietnam, Singapore, already in ASEAN, already have extra protection under the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. Malaysian investors in Vietnam can already sue the Vietnamese government at the International Tribunal, compound interest, all okay already. Malaysia already has a treaty with Chile, already protects Malaysian investors in Chile. So that leaves Mexico, Peru. Japan. Japan, we probably trust the courts, right? So Mexico, Peru. So if Malaysian investors are having such trouble in Mexico and Peru that they don't like the domestic law and the domestic courts, they have some options. Most governments are desperate for foreign direct investment. Please, please come. I will give you anything. So Petronas goes to Mexico. The Mexican government could sign a contract with Petronas to protect Petronas's investment, the same as if it was in the TPP investment chapter. You can go to an international tribunal, you can get compound interest, your expected profits, all protected, everything. And then it just protects the Petronas investment in Mexico. It does not restrict Malaysia's ability to regulate all Mexican investments in Malaysia, including hot money in the stock market. So it's a very specific solution for that company's problems and not restricting general policy space between the two countries. So if that contract is not enough, Petronas or the Malaysian investor, Maybank, whoever in Mexico, could take out political risk insurance. They say, okay, if you take over my oil well, I claim from my insurance company lah. It's like in my house, I take out insurance for fire. It's not the government pays my insurance, I must pay my insurance. And then I pass the costs on, like Petronas pass the cost on to the consumers or whatever. If that is not enough, then you could do due diligence and you say, look, do I really want to invest in Mexico? In capitalism, it is supposed to be you sink or swim on your own. Before you invest in Iraq, you see, is there a war going on? Maybe my factory will be bombed. Maybe I don't want to invest there. Maybe I should invest in a country without a war instead. So this is what you are supposed to do, due diligence before you invest. That's the name of capitalism. So the previous Australian government, I think, was saying, that's why they were opposing investor-to-state dispute settlement, the left-wing Labor Party government. They were saying, look, it's not the government's job to protect our investors overseas. They should be protecting themselves. They should do their due diligence. They should take out political risk insurance. They should sign contracts. It's not the government that gives them free political risk insurance by signing an investment treaty, which restricts the government's ability to regulate. So for the few Malaysian investors in Mexico and Peru, they have a lot of options, including don't invest there, invest somewhere safer. That would mean that at least Australia is not restricted, Malaysia is not restricted in its ability to regulate. So yeah, I don't know if there's any other questions.
Oral question. Why is the US government pushing to protect the private sector?
So there are a lot of answers to this question. So more specifically than the general point is that in the US they have campaign financing, right? Their presidential campaigns cost how many billions of dollars in advertising? They get that money from donations from companies. If the companies give the donations, they expect something in return. They want the policies. So for example, Big Pharma, the patent-owning medicine companies, they donate to both sides. Tobacco companies donate to everybody. And then when they are elected, they want their money's worth, right? So that's number one, the money. And next year they want to get the donations from the same companies, so they better do what they want. The second thing is the US has a system of what we call cleared advisors. So they are 800 people who can see the negotiating text during the negotiations and give comments and what they want in it and reports. And I think almost all of them are multinational companies. They have like, on the Labour Committee, they have trade unionists, but not on the other committees. On the Medicines Committee, they have one generic company, the rest is Big Pharma, the patent owners. So the generic company is always voted down. So those guys are the ones who give the advice to the US government. And you can see how influential they are in another report that the US government puts out every year called Special 301. And this is about how much they don't like other countries' intellectual property standards. So countries are already complying with what the WTO does. The US says, this is not enough. I want you to give more protection for my medicines and so on, my Hollywood movies. So every year they put out a report, how such countries are not doing the extra that the US wants them to do. And you see that in the US they have a process that Big Pharma, the patent-owning pharmaceutical companies, they give a submission for this report. And it's a bit of an academic exercise. Every year the university law professors in the US look at what the demands were of the pharmaceutical companies and how close the government report is to their demands. And depending on the year, it's 95% of what the pharmaceutical companies demanded is what is the US government's own personal position. It's almost exact copy. But the funny thing is that within the US there is a split. So the US has both Big Pharma, the patent-owning companies, and also a generic industry. But they only choose to listen to Big Pharma. They don't listen to the generic companies who are being screwed over, is the word to say, by their own government. And this plays out in different ways. Like the US car companies who manufacture cars, Ford and GM, Holden, whoever, they have to pay the health insurance in the US. When medicine prices are high, they have to pay more for the health insurance for their workers. So they actually don't like the medicine companies getting longer patents, more monopolies. And so they fight with the medicine companies and say, we don't want you to get these longer patents, because I think they told me it's like $1,000 extra or $1,500 extra cost per car in paying the health insurance, which means they're not competitive with the Japanese cars and so on, and they lose business. So there is a split within the US. There are US patients who need medicines. It's also unaffordable for US patients. So in this TPP, the very famous in the US AARP, the pensioners, very big, powerful NGO of all the retired people, they came out against biologics exclusivity, I think of 12 years or whatever. They didn't want 8, they didn't want 12. Because in the US, their current law is a 12-year monopoly on these biologic medicines, even when they're not patented. But the Obama White House budget every year says, we cannot afford it. We want to go down to 7 years. But they can't get it through their Congress, because their Congress is paid for by Big Pharma, so they go for the longer. So even the Obama White House cannot afford. The executive branch cannot afford their own 12-year monopoly and want to bring it down to 7. So they didn't want to lock it in at more than 7 in the TPP, or they could never come down. The other funny one is the US state parliaments. The 50 states in the US each have their own parliament. Every 2 years, they pass a resolution saying, no investor-to-state dispute settlement in US free trade agreements, because we want to regulate. Because even though the US government has never lost, they often challenge state government laws. Like California has tough environmental laws, often challenged. And so even though they've never lost, every year the US state parliaments say, we don't want ISDS. Please, you don't put ISDS. And yet the US Trade Ministry keeps negotiating ISDS. So who does the US government listen to? It's a mixed bag. It's not their own state parliaments. It's not their generic industry. It's not their patients. It's not their car companies on medicines. They listen to their car companies about tariffs and about currency, but they don't listen to them on medicines. So it's a bit of a mixture who they listen to, and a lot of it is from the campaign financing for the presidential and other elections. Yeah.
Just one clarification. The Great Advisory Part is requested from the Malaysian government to get the Great Advisor status, and from 2013 requested. Middle of last year, the cabinet agreed to have a Great Advisor status. They invited some 50 people, including 2 representatives from BANTAH. Name must be approved by cabinet. So they given numbers of names, approved. I think 2 names were approved, myself and our lawyers in BANTAH. They said, okay, they said the condition is, firstly, you need to sign OSA, Official Secretary Act. Second, you need to sign the NGA. And because of that, I cannot speak. So I do not want to sign because I want to speak for the truth. But when we send our lawyers there is a third condition, which is you cannot see the text.
So what is the point?
So we didn't join the Great Advisor. We don't see the reason to do so.
Yeah. And so, oh, by the way, in the US, in the cleared advisors, the other part of the story is that the public health NGOs representing the patients, they sued the US government to get themselves onto the cleared advisor committee, and they got 1 spot out of whatever, 20 people on the committee. So when they come to vote, Big Pharma still all votes for longer intellectual property, stronger intellectual property, and they get voted down. But they had to sue their own government even to get 1 person on, plus 1 generic company. The rest are Big Pharma. Certainly no human rights groups or anything. No human rights committee. Yeah. Ah, yeah. But not like health and other human rights. Yeah. And corporate advisors. Yeah. I think that's a sign. Already got ways, right?
So, yeah, okay. Thank you very much. I'm sure you all can answer more questions. But thank you very much, Sanya, and also thank you everyone for your attendance. And I'm really surprised so many of you all turned up.
And until 10 o'clock. Thank you, on a weeknight.
So many questions too. So we hope that you all will join the protest on the 23rd of
Saturday.
next Saturday.
2 p.m.
2 p.m. at Dataran Merdeka. Yeah. So.
And if they want further information about BANTAH actions, where do they go? Okay.
Yeah, can. Yeah, we really hope that everyone would be able to join. I'm sure that MTEC is actually led by MTEC. Simply because if you hear all the facts and all that, you will know why we have to BANTAH. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.